We're looking at Leonardo's Last Supper. Very, very, very famous image.
Leonardo da Vinci is seen as perhaps the greatest painter of all time, and it's in large part because of this painting.
Yes.
Although the painting is a mess.
It really is. First of all, let's talk about where it is. It's
Okay.
in the refectory, or the room where the monks would eat,
It's their cafeteria
in a monastery in Milan.
in Santa Maria del Grazia.
Right. And it's a perfect subject, right, for a room where the monks would eat, because
It's
they could
so-
look up and see Christ and the apostles having their last meal together before Christ was betrayed.
That's true, but it's so sort of self-evident that that's what should be in there,
It's
right?
true.
The
That's
most
true.
famous meal and the
Right.
thing that the monks would reflect on.
Right, as they ate. And so, yes, the fresco is in terrible shape. Actually, it's not a good idea to call it a fresco because it's really a kind of mixed media mess.
Leonardo was an inventor, and he was exploring the ways that he could really derive the greatest benefit from these media. So he mixed oil paint and
Yes,
fresco and a
yes.
little bit of tempera,
Yes.
and it didn't work.
No, and he didn't paint on wet plaster, and so the paint never really adhered to the wall.
And the wall itself was too thin, and moisture came in from the outside.
Oh.
So, according to accounts, actually, the painting started to deteriorate
Within a
soon
few years.
after. Yeah, he finished it.
Yes.
And of course, then it was made worse because people tried to restore it. Lots of painting was added later
Yeah.
by other people.
The paint just flaked off the wall, I think, and started to lift off of the wall.
But we're very lucky in that the painting has just undergone a 20-year conservation effort and has just been revealed again
Yes.
fairly recently.
And what they did was they removed all of the paint applied by later restorers.
So although there's not much left,
Everything that's there is Leonardo's.
okay,
So that's good.
So we can feel confident in what
Yes,
we're looking at.
exactly. That it
Okay.
is indeed the work of Leonardo.
It's such an incredible painting.
It is, and it's, I always think about this as 13 people eating dinner. It's sort of the problem the artist faces, and then needing to draw attention to the two, telling the story of the Last Supper, and in doing that, needing to draw attention to Christ as the main figure and also the figure of Judas.
And actually, the way the entire story unfolds, not only at this moment, but then in subsequent scenes.
Right.
And all of that is really revealed here. Maybe
Exactly.
we should start off by talking through a little bit of the story.
Sure.
Okay, so this is that moment when that is very famous when Christ says to his apostles,
One of you will betray me.
just imagine how sort of terrifying or powerful that statement must have been.
Imagine sitting with all of your closest friends and family.
The people you trust most.
More than anything in the world. And you've shared so much with them. And you know that one of them is going to betray you, to turn you in, and you'll be arrested. You'll be tried. Christ sees the future here. He knows what the future holds. And he says, one of you will betray me. This terrible, terrible thing.
But what's incredible is, as we see the emotional reactions of these figures sort of emanating outward from that center, it's so ironic. Christ is the calm middle.
He is. He knows that this is his destiny, and he's accepted it, I think.
So how has Leonardo gotten that across? I mean, you've got this incredible image where you have just the emotional sort of outrage and anger and questioning
Right.
of all
is
of the
it me?
apostles.
Am I going to betray him? The
Yeah,
apostles say.
these fantastic
is this God's
moments.
plan?
And then Christ in the center, very calm, very deliberative, almost meditative, really.
Mm-hmm.
So what has Leonardo done to really create that sense?
Of divinity and calmness around Christ?
Well, that was an enormously important idea for Leonardo. So how does he pull that off here? And how does that really represent the High Renaissance?
Yes, those are key questions. And I think that Leonardo does it in about 20 different ways.
Yes.
Because he's Leonardo. And so he really uses the tools that an artist has at hand to communicate those ideas. He, first of all, most obviously puts Christ as the vanishing point of the linear perspective system.
So if we look at the tapestries that hang on the walls,
Right,
on
or
either
the
side,
ceiling, the coffers in the
coffers in
ceiling.
the ceiling, all of that points right down to Christ's head.
Exactly. And so our eye is sort of drawn there unconsciously. Also, Christ's head is the only head framed entirely by window and by light coming through that window. So we almost read that in addition to that sort of circular pediment above the window, as a kind of halo of light around Christ's head. So although we have no halos, unlike the early Renaissance, Leonardo's ditched halos, we do still have a sense of divine light.
A kind of symbolic reference
Right.
to the halo and to that divinity. Yeah, oh, that's so interesting. And of course, that pediment, that arcing pediment, which is barely visible above the middle window,
Right.
is creating a kind of perfect circle in which Christ's face would be dead center. And actually, if you continue to draw that arc down, you would just touch Christ's fingers, in a sense, enclosing the triangle that is Christ's body
Yeah.
in a kind of perfect geometric form.
Right, so you have that sense of pyramid, circles, geometry, and also in that way a kind of higher order to the world.
Okay.
That this isn't merely the world of appearances, but a world in which there is divine structure
And a kind of perfection,
and divine
really.
plan.
Because I think one of the ways in which geometry was understood was as an expression of divinity, of perfection, of a kind of
Exactly.
heavenly order, as you say.
Exactly.
And so in some ways, Leonardo is really, in a sense, trying to create an expression, even in the tumult of the scene, of the eternal.
Exactly. And we see that in the 3 windows in the back, the 4 tapestries on either wall. There's a sense of geometry, of mathematics, and most importantly, perhaps, of simplicity. Leonardo has pared everything down. And so unlike earlier versions of the Last Supper, where everything was so distracting, where, the table and the room and,
Yes.
and what they were eating and the tablecloth and the floor and, and everything looks so real. Here, Leonardo, it's just as real, but Leonardo's pared everything down. And so we have a sense of that purity,
It's true.
of it sort of residing simultaneously in the real world, but also in a kind of divine realm.
And that's really, in a sense, the essence of the High Renaissance and,
Yes.
its goals.
Yes.
I think absolutely. And you're absolutely right. There's a tremendous amount of realism, probably more so than's ever existed in painting
That's
before.
right.
If you look at the still life on the table, it's extraordinary. If you look at Leonardo's understanding of the anatomy of the body, of the
Yeah.
psychology of these figures.
Of the way figures move in
That's right.
groups,
That's right. Well, the groupings are interesting because you've
Right.
got Christ in the center, and then you've got 4 groups of 3 figures each. And the most important figures are sort of bunched around Christ. You had mentioned just a moment ago, one of the apostles almost questioning themselves. Is it me? And you've got Philip in the red, 3 figures to the left of Christ, pointing inward, saying, could this be me that betrays you? The figure next to him is pushing his arms outward, his chest.
How could it be?
How could this happen?
One of us
That's
is going,
right.
how could you say such a thing?
Which is really just,
Yes.
it's a wonderfully
You
sort
can
of
hear
contrast and
all
expression.
of those conversations.
It's just fabulous.
It's incredibly expressive and dramatic.
Then on the other side,
The quiet
you've got a
side.
quieter, much quieter group,
Well,
but
a kind
a
of
much more.
tension.
This is where the real action is taking
Yes,
place.
because Judas is in the foreground of that group.
The smaller figure whose face is in the shadow,
Yes.
facing away from us.
Yes, his face is in the shadow, and it's a little hard to tell this now, but Leonardo made him very ugly.
Clutching, by the way,
The bag of money.
the bag of silver that he had already received for betraying Christ the very
Right.
next day, because it will be this man who kisses Christ to betray him to the soldiers.
Right, who he betrays his identity, and
That's
the
right.
Romans arrest him. And so Judas sort of grabs the money, reaches for the bread, which also helps to identify him, and pulls his body back as though he said, how does he know?
Incredible contrast to this, because Leonardo is always putting contrasting figures together. Just as Judas pulls back and seems diminished by shadow and scale, in contrast to that, Peter, who
lurches
forward to protect Christ, his hand becomes almost like the blade of a knife, and he wants to know who it is.
I'm going to get that
Well,
person.
Peter is really, in a sense, Christ's bodyguard throughout so much of the history of painting and so much of the narrative of the New Testament, and he is absolutely active and
Clutching
furious.
a knife in his right hand.
That's right, and furious.
Yes,
And contrast that fury with the calmness
of John.
who is the one figure in the painting that most closely mimics visually Christ himself, wearing the same colors, although in reverse. Very passive figure, almost feminine.
And that really identifies him to any viewer. See, I mean, one of the things I think that we miss is that were we living in the early 16th century when this was painted, we would have known each of these apostles.
By these very attributes.
Exactly. We would have known that, that was Peter, leaning forward in an angry way, clutching a knife, that Judas had the bag of silver, that John put his head down or kind of reclined, or...
so it's almost as if they're wearing name badges.
It is. I mean, we can't tell so easily, but back then they could. And my favorite figures are the three figures on the far right, who just look like, they're just discussing it amongst themselves.
If you look at the
really
middle,
trying to make sense of this. How
they're
could
arguing,
this be?
yes.
Well, I don't know, but that's what he said. You can hear this whole conversation.
There's a fabulous gesture among those three.
Yeah.
If you look at the middle figure,
slapping his hand.
That's right, but the back of his hand against his palm.
Right.
You can just see somebody just arguing almost for the sake of it. Yeah.
So maybe this is a good moment to tell that story about Leonardo and the prior, because we know that the prior who was in charge of the monastery where Leonardo was painting this kept walking in and seeing Leonardo, not doing much of anything.
Sitting in front of the painting.
And looking at it.
But not painting.
And the prior thought to himself, well, what a lazy man this is. I've got the monks hoeing in the field, and, this guy's got to get to work.
After all, the Duke is actually paying for this painting.
Right, and he sees Leonardo sitting around.
And so he complains.
He complains to the Duke of Milan, who commissioned it, and says, he's not doing anything. And so the Duke kind of knows better, but he calls Leonardo in and says, hey, what's up? And Leonardo, according to a story from Vasari, says, well, a painter's work does not happen with his hands. And the work of a painter happens in the painter's mind, where we work out the designs and the ideas that we carry out with our hands.
So this is really a sort of important moment, because it really starts to differentiate what art is as opposed to what labor is.
That's right. That art is something that happens in the mind, that it's connected to the imagination, to the visionary, to the idea of needing to be inspired, and not something that you can sort of clock in and out of and get paid for by the hour.
But it's so interesting, because for Leonardo especially, somebody who's versed in science in a way that few were, somebody who understood the human body, who dissected the human body, somebody who studied nature very, very carefully. Art was this much larger entity that was absolutely connected to nature, to science, to philosophy.
That encompassed everything.
That's right.
Right.